Hello, good evening everyone. My name's Ed West. Thanks for coming for the Canon Club. I think this is our 6th, if I'm correct, maybe it's our 7th. And this coming year we're planning to scale it up a little bit to hopefully do it every month. And apparently we have investors, so there'll be plenty more coming in the future. So tonight we have one of the greats, the biggies, Goethe. He's up there with your Shakespeares, your Dantes. He's, I think he's the second German we've had after Wagner. So we've basically covered Germany then. And talking on the subject, we have Dr. Sebastian Milbank, who's a philosopher and theologian by background, and also associate editor of The Critic. And you have 2 books on the go about Christianity, is that correct? So, as usual, we are going to have a 45-minute talk, and then we'll have 15 minutes. There's a bar downstairs, as you know, and then we'll have questions after, and we should be wrapped up by 8:30, hopefully, or 9 or something. And then I think the bar's still open afterwards, so we can hang around and say hello. If you're a subscriber to my Substack, then please come and say hello. If you've said hello already, don't take offense, I'm terrible with faces, but names. But I hope you'll have a good evening, and give a big round of applause to Sebastian.
Right, so first of all, I'll just say before I begin that we'll only be scraping the surface of Goethe, and if you know Goethe, you'll know why, and if not, you will soon see why. I'm talking to you tonight about Goethe, and not without a little trepidation, because I'm not a Goethe expert. Of course, being a Goethe expert is rather a hard thing to be, unless you happen to have the good fortune to be a polymath yourself. In order to fully understand Goethe, you'd probably need to be a literary scholar, a dramatist, a theologian, a philosopher, a scientist, a poet, a politician, a painter, and a novelist, because Goethe was all of these things, and unlike some dabbling polymaths, he reached the zenith of many of these arts in his own lifetime. This was not hard enough of a challenge. Much of what Goethe was, we can no longer hope to be, even if we wish to. Goethe was one of the chief men of letters at the very height of the epistolary age, and those who don't follow these things, it means people wrote a heck of a lot of letters to each other, and they actually really did read them, and they comprised much of what European literature was. Indeed, Goethe wrote some of the really important epistolary novels of the time. So rather like Bram Stoker, if you're familiar with him, these were novels written as letters, a series of letters. So Goethe was a lot of things we couldn't hope to be anymore. He was a courtier in the old sense, and even pursued a mad chivalric courtship at perhaps the last period of history in which that was remotely possible. He was a romantic pilgrim and an ecstatic mystic in a landscape and within a society that no longer exists. Goethe appears, appropriately enough, at the peak of an unclimbable mountain, wreathed in the densest fog. Faced with such German sublimity, the Englishman must pause a moment and consult the facts. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was born in Frankfurt in 1749 to prosperous bourgeois parents. He died in Weimar in 1832 as one of the most lauded men in Europe, having outlived most of his family and his friends. It's hard to describe his life in a few minutes or with perfect clarity. It's better to see him illuminated in a flash of lightning, startling and sudden, ascending to the unscalable heights, and to sit still for a moment with his afterimage fading before our eyes. The first lightning bolt strikes early, unbelievably early. Goethe is only 25, and everyone in Europe already knows his name. He has written a book that has scandalized the known world, The Sorrows of Young Werther. Written for a series of letters, the passionate story of obsessive, untimely suicidal love is accused of inspiring thousands of tragedies as Romanticism sweeps through the youth of Europe. He has become one of the defining figures of the Sturm and Drang movement in German literature. Storm and stress. And lightning strikes twice. The year is now 1782, and Goethe, still a young man, is at the court of Weimar and has been made the Chancellor of the Grand Duchy of Saxe-Weimar, the equivalent of the Prime Minister of a significant German state. Goethe transformed the administration of what is effectively a small country, modernising its economy and laws, navigating it through diplomatic crises, preparing it for war, and transforming it into a cultural superpower, the heartland of what will come to be known as Weimar classicism. The curtain descends. And when it rises again, we find our protagonist ambling through the Mediterranean sunlight. It is Italy in 1787, and a handsome middle-aged man, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, is lounging in the ruins of ancient Rome. He has travelled southwards incognito, living with artists, and falling in love with a 23-year-old girl called Faustina. Now it is 1812, and we find Goethe meeting an admirer, Ludwig von Beethoven. Increasingly deaf, the composer is about to embark on the most innovative period of his composition. Goethe, not to be outdone, has recently completed the first volume of one of the first works of modern biography and psychology, his autobiographical Poetry and Truth. It is 1823, and Goethe, the grand old age of 72, is still an absurd and heartbroken romantic. He has just had his marriage proposal to an Ulrich von Lewitzau, a girl of only 19, refused. Well, it might have been. He's sitting in a carriage, composing one of the greatest poems of his life, the Marienbad Elegy, which begins, Mir ist das all, ich bin mir selbst verloren. To me is all, I to myself am lost. It is 1832, and Goethe is dying. His last words, themselves a matter of disputed legend, are mehr Licht, more light. Well, if Goethe's life were a biopic, it would have to be 6 hours long and be bloody implausible. We have our fractured portrait of this remarkable man, a sense of scale and majesty, a flash of wounded humanity, of endless striving and sweet moments of peace. But what we don't yet know is why he mattered, why he was famous then and now, and why Germany is still in his shadow. If his life was remarkable, his afterlife is scarcely less so. Having directly touched the lives of contemporaries like Schiller, Herder, the von Humboldt brothers, Fichte and Hegel, amongst just a few, his work rippled throughout German and European literature and philosophy. He was a touchstone for a whole generation of English writers, from Byron to Thomas Carlyle. In Germany, his already vast reputation only grew as the disparate states of the German Empire moved towards unification, and when the German Empire collapsed in 1919, the framers of a new German Republic met in Weimar, refounding German identity on the glories of Weimar classicism, and upon Goethe in particular. And as this Weimar Republic soon enough descended into chaos of running street battles between paramilitaries, another German polymath, Oswald Spengler, applied Goethe's ideas about psychology, history and poetry to a grand theory of the rise and fall of civilizations entitled The Decline of the West. Western European civilizations was described, taking the protagonist of Goethe's most famous work as an inspiration, as Faustian, a culture that Spengler saw as defined by a restless, yearning, Promethean striving to exceed all bounds and limits. So the scale and influence of Goethe's life and legacy is rather hard to understand without a sense of the unique and consequential moment of history in which he lived. So in Hegelian terms, Goethe was a man of destiny, a person who embodied the spirit of a new age and the will of what Hegel called the Weltgeist, or world soul. Late 18th century Europe was a continent on the brink of modernity. Goethe's youth coincided with the Industrial Revolution in England and the Jacobin Revolution in France. Yet as life in England and France was transformed through revolutionary ideas and technology, Germany was still sitting by the riverbank of history, dangling its toes in the current. Whilst England and France were both united kingdoms with strong central administrations going back to the Middle Ages, Germany was historically governed by a figure called the Holy Roman Emperor, a successor to Charlemagne, who ruled over a highly decentralised feudal realm made up of bishoprics, duchies, small kingdoms and city-states. Germany was also the birthplace of the Protestant Reformation, and for much of the 16th and 17th centuries it was riven by terrible religious conflict, culminating in the catastrophes of the 30 Years' War. So these conditions, which left Germany weak and divided compared to many of its neighbours, did however also create the conditions of a unique age of cultural and intellectual invention. Germany had a gigantic aristocracy, the most powerful of whom, the imperial electors and princes, could command the economic resources of what were in effect small nation-states. As a period of relative peace descended on the imperial lands, the cities and statelets of Germany formed an extraordinary network of patronage. From the late 17th to 18th centuries, philosophy, science and art flourished. Germany became an important centre for what will become known as the Enlightenment, as well as producing some of the very greatest Baroque architecture and music in Europe. Yet Germany is a territory riven by paradox. The great patrons of iconoclastic political theory, theology and literature are the feudal aristocracy. The powerful Prussian and Austrian monarchies are themselves so-called enlightened despotisms, nurturing radical thought, yet wielding ruthless authority to keep order within their sprawling empires. And despite being the cradle of astonishingly modern ideas, German social and economic conditions are far more old-fashioned than those in France or in England. The same structures that create peace and patronage are also resistant to the battering tides of history, as the threefold structure of the ancient medieval estates survived surprisingly untouched into the German early modern period. While society is being rationalised in France and England, German workers remain in medieval guilds and fraternities, and traditional deference to social authority continues. So, the result of all this is a rather extraordinary historical moment, the times in which Goethe lived in which the medieval and modern worlds exist side by side, face to face. Revolutionary thought flourishes in the walled gardens of a static social order. The sort of life that Goethe leads is only possible because of this unique confluence of circumstances. He's able to work in his laboratory, live a life of shockingly contemporary sexual freedom, act out the part of the Baroque courtier, modernise a feudal administration, and fully explore his creative and practical gifts without meeting any real limits or resistance. This would not have been possible to the same extent even a generation ago, when German elites were more conservative, nor later on, as German institutions professionalised. Put bluntly, nobody before or since would have put up with Goethe. But for one golden moment, everything was possible for a man of his talents, character, and ambition. Oh, sorry, we've got a screen issue. But what precisely is happening in Goethe's own lifetime? And why is Germany, so long at peace, suddenly changing, and so fast? The answer lies with a fellow man of destiny, though in a very different sense, Napoleon Bonaparte. As we discussed, Germany at the time is under the nominal authority of the Holy Roman Empire. Even if we don't accept Voltaire's judgment that it was neither holy, Roman, nor particularly an empire, it was certainly a much reduced force by the end of the 18th century. In effect, Germany at this time was divided into the spheres of influence of two German great powers, the Kingdom of Austria under the Habsburg dynasty and the Kingdom of Prussia under the Hohenzollerns. Now, if you just look on the screen there, I hope you can all see it. You see up there in blue we have Prussia, and there in the yellow the Austrian Empire. And these territories have effectively divided the Holy Roman Empire into two spheres of influence. These empires are extremely powerful and governed extensive empires stretching well beyond the borders of the traditional Holy Roman Empire. So they stretch all the way into the Balkans for the Austrians, all the way up to the Baltic for the Prussians. Yet neither was sufficiently strong to unify Germany into a single cohesive national empire. So all of that's to say that when, following the chaos of the French Revolution, Napoleon emerges Caesar-like and turns France into a war machine, he rather shakes things up. He's someone who's fighting against the reactionary powers of old Europe, so everything that Germany is, bishops, princes, silly little duchies with their sort of 5 soldiers, he's against them. And he topples them over and he leaves in their place modern constitutions, some of which persist to this day. So in a series of victorious wars over the German states, he ends the Holy Roman Empire forever, formally. And he creates in what is now Western Germany a kind of nation called the Confederation of the Rhine, a sort of German proto-state, something that will go on to inspire German nationalists. But Napoleon is ultimately defeated, and the Confederation is dissolved, and Germany doesn't quite go back to normal. The Holy Roman Empire never returns, and the experience of war, confederation, and revolutionary politics sows the seeds of nationalist sentiment and liberal politics. German liberals push for national unification, culminating in the revolutions of 1848, the springtime of nations which rock the European continent. Ultimately, unification comes about, but at the point of a bayonet and in the hands of the militaristic Kingdom of Prussia. So where's Goethe in all this? Goethe stands at the midpoint, the fulcrum of the shift from the Holy Roman Empire towards national unification. He's born right there in the middle of Germany, in Frankfurt, a free imperial city and the sometime capital of the Holy Roman Empire. He ends his life in the capital of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, a princely state transformed into a liberal constitutional monarchy in Goethe's own lifetime and partly at his own hands. And all of this in a Germany swiftly recovering from the Napoleonic Wars and well on its way to nationhood and modernity. So we've had our first startling glimpse of Goethe's astonishing life, and we've also taken a whirlwind tour through the history of Germany that churned and buffeted over those years. But let's put the vast abstractions and bombast of German thought and events in the background for a moment. And let's take up instead the steady rhythm of Goethe the man, trudging his way up the slope to those impossible heights. We have the Goethe house in Frankfurt, where Goethe was born. And Goethe arrived in this world already dead. In his own words, "I came into the world as dead, and only after various efforts was I enabled to see the light." And he was born in this fine old 17th century house that you see on the left. Now, Frankfurt retained its medieval character for a very long time. And that's a 19th century print. And in Goethe's day, it would have been even more strikingly Gothic and medieval in its character. It would have been a sort of fairy tale place. It was a city famous for its fairs and processions. It was at the heart of imperial commerce and diplomacy. And this psychological landscape is also the same one that gives to Goethe's Faust its special quality. It's identifiably Frankfurt. And we can see in Frankfurt the germ of the great comfort in the ordinary and the rowdy humanism that Goethe himself found in the rough and cheerful crowds that passed beneath the overhanging facade of his childhood home. The house itself was a cradle of terrors and delights in equal measure, an old, many-cornered and gloomy arrangement, one adapted to awaken dread and terror in childish minds. It contained the embryo of many future passions and obsessions. A frightened infant Goethe, seeking to crawl into bed with a servant, was chased back to his bed by a stern father, but comforted by the promises of peaches from his mother. Future dramatist was entertained with a puppet show by his grandfather, and once hurled much of the breakable contents of the house from an upper window into the street as an enthusiastic public shouted, "More!" Hidden in a treasured anteroom, his father had amassed a trove of Italian art and sculpture, which Goethe would tiptoe in to wonder at. And, when the bustle of the street or the authority of parents intruded too far, young Goethe would stare out of the back window longingly at forbidden gardens. A precocious boy, his father inspired in Goethe thoughts of travel and adventure, encouraging him to attend university as soon as possible and to one day travel to Italy and see the wonders of the classical world. So as Goethe grows up, this yearning for adventure takes a more transgressive form. Whilst his father imagines for him A gilded career in law and administration, elegantly framed with the sophistication of travel and education, there is a very Germanic longing in Goethe for the ordinary, the base, and the visceral. If the elegant and enlightened realm of civilized society and the shining visions of neoclassicism attracted Goethe, something else spoke just as strongly. The Gothic world of sexual desire, mystical ecstasy, and of good and evil run gloriously riot. As Goethe writes, every bird has its decoy, and every man is led and misled in a way peculiar to himself. Nature, education, circumstance, and habit kept me apart from all that was rude, and though I often came into contact with the lower classes of people, particularly mechanics, no close connection grew out of it. I had indeed boldness enough to undertake something uncommon and perhaps dangerous, and many times felt disposed to do so, but I was without the handle by which to grasp and hold it. This handle was soon to emerge. This begins the chapter that details his youthful affair with the girl he names Gretchen, the same name he gives to the tragic heroine of his Faust play. Goethe is 14, and Frankfurt is exploding to life around him, and he is wandering the town, misbehaving. The city is preparing, as you see on the left, for an imperial coronation, as elector counts ride into town with their retinues and the population of the city temporarily swells to bursting point. Goethe is composing erotic verses for a friend to send to his lover when he spies an innkeeper's daughter. Admiring her figure from behind, he falls in love. The beauty of Gretchen entrances the young Goethe, and the pair begin a doomed courtship. He writes, this eminent envoy, to honour the day, had quite passed over his unfavourably situated quarters, and in their stead had caused the great esplanade of linden trees in the horse market to be decorated in the front with a portal illuminated with colours, and at the back with a still more magnificent prospect. The entire enclosure was marked by lamps. Between the trees stood pyramids and spheres of light upon transparent pedestals. From one tree to another were stretched glittering garlands, on which floated suspended lights. In several places, bread and sausages were distributed among the people, and there was no want of wine. Here now, four abreast, we walked very comfortably up and down, and I, by Gretchen's side, fancied that I really walked in those happy Elysian fields where they pluck from the trees crystal cups that immediately fill themselves with the wine desired, and shake down fruits that change into every dish at will. At last, we felt such a necessity, and conducted by Pylades, we found a neat, well-arranged eating house. When we encountered no more guests, and as everybody was going about the streets, we were all the better pleased, and passed the greatest part of the night most happily and cheerfully in the feelings of friendship, love, and attachment. When I had accompanied Gretchen as far as her door, she kissed me on the forehead. It was the first and last time that she greeted me this favour, for alas, I was not to see her again. Heartbroken, nothing of the glories that followed, neither the great gala day, nor what happened on the occasion of so many elevations of rank, nor the public table of the emperor and king, could move the young poet. Ill and heartbroken, the Gothic grandeur of Frankfurt had turned sour for Goethe. My ramblings through the streets had ceased. I now, like others, only went such ways as were necessary. I never went again into Gretchen's quarter of the city, nor even into its vicinity, and as my old walls and towers became gradually disagreeable to me, so also was I displeased at the constitution of the city. All that hitherto seemed worthy of honour now appeared to me in distorted shape. Goethe rebels from the life of a respectable old lawyer dreaming away in the decaying capital of a dying empire. In thought, I threw away my legal studies and devoted myself solely to the languages, to antiquities, to history, and to all that flows from them. So determined, Goethe departs for Leipzig and for university, and turns his back on his juvenile imagination. I burnt up poetry and prose, plans, sketches, and projects, all together on the kitchen hearth, and threw our good old landlady into no small fright and anxiety by the smoke which filled the whole house. It's a magnificent story. But pay close attention to the title of the autobiography that contains it, Poetry and Truth. Poetry and Truth. For Goethe, they're not necessarily one and the same thing. And the search for truth through poetry and poetry through truth is not a straight or straightforward path. For as those in the audience with some knowledge of Goethe's life may already know, this story is almost certainly just that, a story. 14-year-old Goethe, living in his family home, is unlikely to have been out at all hours of dubious company, picking up passing girls. Nor is it particularly credible that having done so, he would be able to persuade his very forceful father to let him attend Leipzig University against his father's ambitions for him. And this is itself rather a testament to Goethe's strength of will, which we'll see again and again. So, what's the real story? The Count is almost certainly based on his affair in Leipzig with one Anna Katharina Schönkopf when he was about 17. His behaviour, emotions and accounts of composing love poetry in taverns are implausible in The Coddled Wunderkind, but entirely believable for the restless and rebellious undergraduate wandering the streets of Leipzig, raising all kinds of hell. Goethe's motives in distorting this episode of his life are not hard to discern. However, in the first instance, he may have rather chivalrously wished to conceal the identity of his former lover. In narrative terms, it allows him to identify his first love affair with the city and the mode of thought he's leaving behind, and to frame it as a suitable allegorical event, the coronation of a Holy Roman Emperor. Much of these emotional and intellectual shifts actually occurred in Leipzig, and during his later illness and return to Frankfurt, does not undermine the psychological and poetic truth of the text. The memories of Leipzig, along with his poetic juvenilia and his failed romance with Anna, all coalesce into a single monolith, an idol he must smash and move past if he is to continue. The collision of old and new worlds, old and new thought, is crucial to the formation of the Romantic imagination. This explosion can be seen in terms of textual development, but it has as its vital catalyst psychology shaped by this sense of dualism and ambiguity about the medieval and classical pasts, the constellation of mysterious nature, and the urgent potentiality of a coming modernity. We can see a shared spirit of an age in Goethe's childhood in the old imperial capital, and, as we see on the left, in the scene of a 10-year-old Byron's arrival in the forbidden and tumble-down halls of Newstead Abbey, of which the poet later wrote, "Through thy battlements, Newstead, the hollow winds whistle. Thou, the halls of my father, art gone to decay." We see in the rigour of Goethe's search for psychological truth and the playfulness of his approach to narrative history and his own unreliability, a man who is in the process of becoming modern. Modernity is conceived in any number of ways, but aside from this clear anticipation of literary modernism and psychological writing, we might define it, in individual terms and for our own purposes, as a sense of alienation, a restless yearning for truth at any cost, and a sense that prior traditions are no longer a channel for that truth. So defined, Goethe is one of the first modern subjects, and a writer whose own life and psychology is a canvas of his work. What do we mean by this? Writing over a century later, Heidegger argues that the work is the origin of the artist. Neither is without the other. Nonetheless, neither is the sole support of the other. In other words, the simplicity of the craft producing the craftsman producing his craft, is a kind of cycle, and Heidegger sees in this part of the answer to the power of technological modernity to erase meaning and disrupt our connection to culture. Yet Goethe escaped this Volkist simplicity at which Heidegger is driving. Whilst Goethe and his literary avatar Faust would dive into the sublimity of nature or the baseness of the commons in search of consolation, he was no less a man of what we call the Enlightenment. We see this in Faust's own embrace of political science, mathematics, administration and economics, which prove a form of magic and mastery as appealing as any witchcraft. And as we will see, this was scarcely less true of Goethe the man. So that's Leipzig on the left, and in Leipzig, Goethe steps out of the shadows of Frankfurt and into the light of history and the age of reason. So Leipzig at the time was sometimes called Little Paris, and it aspired to something of the modernity and elegance of the original. Goethe describes a city of handsome, high and uniform houses, and its famous university, the heart of the German Enlightenment, as a rather stiff place. While students in Jena would terrorise townfolk in medieval fashion, in Leipzig, on the contrary, a student could scarcely be anything else than polite. As soon as he wished to stand on any footing at all with the rich, well-bred and punctilious inhabitants. Law and philosophy, the form of which he had come to study, soon bored Goethe in equal measure. German literature was all his passion, and he saw in it a life that was lacking in other subjects. More than the mere study of texts or the writing of pretty verses, literature, whether as prose, poetry or performance, could, he believed, be a regenerative creed with a universal application and significance. So, approached this way, the apparent cacophony of Goethe's discordant interests starts to soften and harmonise into a single, sweet polyphony. The restlessness of his yearnings and travels takes on a more intentional quality. The repetition of projects and passions starts to look like the clear stages of a scientific experiment. For Goethe, literature is not simply entertaining or even edifying. It has power and it has a purpose. The apparent tension between romanticism and classicism in his work in fact form a coherent synthesis. Empiricism, for Goethe, allows literature to be elevated and unified with natural science and philosophy. The unknowable sublimity of nature becomes knowable in man's own quest for self-knowledge and self-improvement, a process that at once looks backwards to human origins and strives forwards in creative, indeterminate process of experimentation. Literature plays a central role because it can reconcile nature and culture, man and the cosmos. The significance of this insight, which you will see more clearly when we look at the body of his work in its entirety, must not be understated. Later authors to Freud give him tremendous credit. Hegel said of Goethe, "When I survey my intellectual development, I find you everywhere interwoven therein, and might well call myself one of your sons. From you, my thought acquired nourishment and the strength to resist abstraction, and found its just course by keeping your constructs in sight as if they were beacons." So, at this moment, we find Goethe discontent both with the Gothic weight of Frankfurt and the frigid, fussy ways of Leipzig. And following a period of illness, he departs to complete his studies in Strasbourg. It is in the Rhineland that Goethe sets his foot firmly on the path of pursuing the vision that we have just discussed. Strasbourg in the 18th century, there we are, that's Strasbourg. Strasbourg in the 18th century was a city within the empire, but governed by France, surrounded, as you see there, by the imposing fortifications of Vauban, and reconstructed by the French in magnificent Baroque fashion. Goethe discovers in Strasbourg a sense of direction and purpose which we find lacking up to this moment. Three of the most consequential encounters of his life occur in Strasbourg. He encounters Herder, he encounters Shakespeare, and he encounters nature. It is in Strasbourg where Goethe first reads Ossian in Shakespeare. Two vital elements in his work spring from these twin fonts. First, in Ossian, he finds in this romantic reinvention of Gaelic poetry a sense of the living power of tradition. And in Shakespeare, he finds a still more consequential influence, both in its unmatched psychological sophistication and the classical pathos and ambiguity of its philosophical and ethical reflections. Herder, meanwhile, a friend and compatriot, is a theologian, poet, and philosopher of history, and a man deeply in sympathy with Goethe's own emerging vision of art and the world. Herder's focus on human psychology is central to history, and his earthly love of folk culture and poetry are at precisely the right moment for our unhappy young scholar. But perhaps as significant as the literary and human influence is Goethe's encounter with the natural world. In Strasbourg, Goethe describes pleasure grounds, partly natural, partly adorned by art in ancient and modern times, all of them visited and enjoyed by a cheerful, merry little people. This time, we also discover in Goethe a fresh and youthful heart, which manifested itself almost for the first time in its full bloom. So, I spent a lot of time on Goethe's origins, because I think we can clearly see the essential elements of the seed that will explode into the riot of achievement that constitutes Goethe's life soon after his departure from Strasbourg. Having ambled slowly within the foothills of youth, we are now raced to the summit and draw together the elements that have been building towards an eruption. The force is building up as Goethe pursues, with little success, a legal career in his hometown. Soon enough, he shoulders the law impatiently aside. He starts to write. He embarks upon a biography of a German mercenary, but it soon bursts from the dusty pages and becomes a play. Gott von Berchlichen debuts in 1773, and it's a work of pure adolescent rebellion, a glorious Gothic rebellion against the stuffiness of his age. Goethe has a disreputable adventurer deliver a speech of startlingly obscene defiance. Me? Surrender? At mercy? With whom do you speak? Am I a robber? Tell your captain that for his imperial majesty I have, as always, due respect. But tell him that he can lick me in the arse. Not yet tired of delighting and outraging his contemporaries, Goethe writes a novel of romantic rebellion and psychological melodrama. The Sorrows of Young Werther, involving a love triangle, a tortured protagonist, and a dramatic suicide. The book becomes increasingly famous and infamous in equal measure. Young men begin dressing like Werther, and a year after its publication, in 1775, Leipzig had to pass a law banning students from imitating their hero. Stories of copycat suicide circulated, and Goethe became an overnight celebrity. And Goethe's fame had reached one of the emerging cultural centres of 18th century Germany, and captured the imagination, you see this figure on the right, of Karl August, Grand Duke of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach. The Duke's mother had transformed Weimar into a centre of the arts, and the city needed a new theatre master and a cultured playmate for the Duke. That such an opportunity could exist for a person as mercurial and radical as Goethe reflects, as I noted earlier, the unique spirit of the age. People of discernment, the Duke said, congratulate me on possessing this man. His intellect, his genius is known. It makes no difference if the world is offended because I have made Dr. Goethe a member of my most important collegium without his having passed through the stages of minor official professor and councillor of state. Well, you think Goethe would be grateful, but in fact, Goethe does nothing to restrain himself in this time. He falls in love with a married lady-in-waiting, one Charlotte von Stein, with whom he pursues a platonic and intellectual romance, and, despite the disapproval of many, he rises rapidly at court and is given political office just 4 years after arriving in Weimar. Each year brings new honours, more money, growing fame, and increasing power. Almost unbelievably, this is also a period of vast creative energy for Goethe. He writes Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, a novel about a man seeking to transcend his bourgeois roots. He composes some of his most significant poetry, including Ölkönig, a profoundly disturbing tale of a boy abducted by a supernatural evil. So Goethe's living a life of astonishing energy and achievement. Yet, there is something still unfinished and unhappy behind the frenzy of activity. His love affair is immature and boyish, and the scale of early success has perhaps in some way frozen his development. And so, in 1786, Goethe slips away from court life and departs for Italy. We find him camply arraying himself on the left. And he'll remain there until 1788. And this caesura sees Goethe explore a childhood fantasy, descend into an anonymity, and pursue a more mature romance with a woman, Faustina. The significance of these sun-drenched years of aesthetic and erotic pilgrimage make themselves felt immediately upon his return to Weimar. Goethe publishes Torquato Tasso, a play partially based on his own unrequited love affair with Charlotte, soon after resuming his place at court. This man is really shameless. And not long thereafter, follows his first serious scientific and philosophical work, The Metamorphosis of Plants. And in this same period, he takes up with the woman who will accompany him for much of the rest of his life. His mistress and later wife, Christiane Vulpius. A 23-year-old milliner, Christian was certainly not wife material for a man at court, not even a man of bourgeois origins. Little scandal would have risen if he had simply kept her quietly in some nearby house, as many men of the era did. But Goethe didn't do that. Goethe instead chose to live quite openly with Christiane, and she would bear his children and share much of his life for years until he finally did marry her in 1806. Goethe's capacity for irreverence and scandal, perhaps imaginable as charming and daring in his youth, only becomes more pronounced as he advances in age and celebrity. Increasingly obese, what we would probably today label as functionally alcoholic, and at one point turfed out of his house by rowdy French soldiers, Goethe does what any of us would do in this circumstance. He spends his time writing the most important works of his life. Well, maybe not quite any of us. From 1808 to 1810, Goethe, now entering his 60s, writes Faust Part 1, Elective Affinities, The Theory of Colour, and the first volume of his autobiography, Poetry and Truth. If departures from university life set off one explosion, and his travels to Italy another, then it was his renewed focus on writing and his mature self-reflection that initiated the third and the most astonishing. Faust is the most famous of his works, and the one, perhaps more than any other, most rigorously explored his own psychology and philosophy. We see in Faust's own meteoric and Promethean rise both Goethe's highest vision for human achievement, but also an intense awareness of its potential pitfalls and moral costs. The terrible fate of Gretchen represents in part Goethe's own uneasy conscience about not just the price paid by the people in his own life for his actions, but the uneasy relationship between the traditional religious piety represented by Gretchen and the self-focused neat religion of Faust and of Goethe himself. We also see, in the scientific psychological method attempted in his earlier works, an incredible evolution in elective affinities, which has developed into a chilly precision and a kind of literary perfection, although it's not the easiest reading. This is effectively sort of experimental literature. And in elective affinities, human loves are condensed into the chemical elements driven by an unseen force of nature. We're seeing here a unity of art and science, one that's likewise reflected in Goethe's colour theory, which is a result of genuine scientific observations, ones that challenge Newtonian ideas and inspire, amongst others, one J.M.W. Turner, and Turner's own thinking about science and spirituality. So, seen this way, Goethe really is Faust, a modern-day Renaissance magician, one who unites art and science, psychology and literature, earthly power and hidden knowledge. Like Faust, he enjoys an uncanny second youth, his creative energies blazing into life again and again. So you think the story's over, but no, over the next 20 years, Goethe will continue to deepen his thinking, render it more subtle, and vanishing perhaps beyond the grasp of his readers. Faust Part 2, published at the very end of his life, almost escapes analysis entirely. He also writes the highly experimental sequel to Wilhelm Meister, and he completes his autobiography, continuing to render his life as the raw stuff of his art. He outlives his wife and children, and dies, as we glimpsed at the beginning, crying out for more light, more, perhaps, of everything. Approaching the end of our talk, and perhaps the beginning of our understanding of Goethe and his significance. We may be tempted to dismiss him as heavy, bombastic, Germanic, excessive, childish. But in his lightness and complexity, the trailing nimbus of his influence extending over the world of words and ideas, we may see the flaring of a familiar spirit, the animating light and energy of modern art, literature, and philosophy, as we now know it. Oh.
So back, thanks so much for that. It's fascinating. I have to admit, I'm always a bit intimidated by German literature, so I have to admit I haven't actually read him before. What would you recommend as sort of starting? What's your ABC
Good
of
question.
Goethe?
Poetry is great
because a lot of it's short and it's
Right.
rather lyrical and beautiful and simple. And it is. I mean, again, a lot of his poetry draws on this kind of folk tradition, something he's influenced by Herder in. So that's very accessible. And if you want to read something, I think probably Faust Part 1. And I
They
think
never show Faust Part 2, do they, on stage? Apparently it's just...
no, it's barely. I mean, you can barely perform Faust Part
Right.
1. So
They're like elephants
God knows
and
how they
stuff
do
in the
Part
second
1.
one.
Yeah, I mean, the second one really is unperformable. But I recommend it's better to. It's better to. I mean, with a lot of his plays, they're better read than performed. Again, it's one of those funny things. He writes an awful lot of plays. Some of them are quite good on the stage, but a lot of them are very experimental and never get performed. So, I mean, or at least not till years after. But yeah, Faust Part 1. It's full of lots of lovely picaresque detail. It's got a very strong plot. It's one of the most accessible, but it's also the one that it sums up very well a lot of what he's trying to do.
My takeaway from this is, I mean, 19th century Germany before unification sounded great, didn't it? It's just all these having 300 little princelings running things, it just allowed for, and you run this tiny little kingdom. You just put a novelist in charge of the army, basically, wasn't he? I mean, he was.
There's a lot to be said for it.
He wasn't he involved in mercenaries for the American War of Independence, but he was on the right side.
Yeah, all the German mercenaries are fighting for us.
Yeah, and there may have been some scandal about some of them just being kind of forced into it.
Oh yeah. Well, it's quite funny because of course the state of German peasants was considerably lower, but they were also a lot more obedient. So they were all horrified at these Americans rising against their feudal monarch. Right. So all these Hessians were turning up and sort of kicking the crap out of these Americans who they thought were very jumped up, and they also saw how well the Americans were living, and the Germanic reaction to that was, how dare they?
I find it such an interesting subject because I read Peter Watson's book, The German Genius, a few years ago. And it covers this. I mean, it covers basically the mid-18th century up to 1933, and during this period, there's just this huge explosion of talent in Germany, and also a kind of national awakening, but also the sense that French is being supplanted by German as the kind of the language.
What period are we thinking of now?
Early 19th century, because obviously French is obviously prestige culture and a prestige language, and German is considered a bit kind of.
Yeah, I mean, France is really the language of Europe and of civilization, even for the Germans for a very long time.
Right. I mean, he said that, didn't he? Because he was quite. I mean, he's quite anti-nationalist. I mean, and that's why they kind of like him now. He's the Goethe Institute.
Goethe's relationship to German nationalism is very ambiguous indeed. I mean, you could say this about anything with Goethe, it's ambiguous. But because so for example, Heidegger doesn't, although he very much admires Goethe, doesn't like how cosmopolitan he is, because, I mean, Heidegger's halfway to being a Nazi.
Right.
But with Goethe, he's someone who on the one hand, he sort of wants to be like a kind of national poet to the German people. He very much wants to be the German Shakespeare. And he both is and isn't that in all sorts of interesting ways. And he's trying to kind of produce a bit like Tolkien sort of trying to create a legendarium for the English who lack it. He's trying to kind of create a sophisticated poetic culture and of course theatrical culture for a Germany that lacks it. And of course the aristocracy really want this. But his feelings about the idea of German nationhood are much more ambiguous. So he's a believer in German culture, and he's a believer in sort of, but he's not a believer in German nationhood necessarily. Yeah,
it's this kind of thing. I like Germany so much. I'm glad there were, 300 or whatever.
Yeah.
I always have. What is also interesting is that, it seems almost like the first, I suppose, you might say, moral panic, or the first kind of clash between a kind of rebellious youth. I don't know if that's true, but I always get the impression when people say about the sort of Romantic poets in England, they sort of preempt the 1960s in a way, because they're this sort of, young guys going around basically trying to shag as many women as possible, but doing it in a poetic way. And there's this kind of thing about young men killing. I mean, were lots of young men killing themselves? Has anyone actually looked at the statistics?
Yeah, so probably they weren't. There were a few famous suicides that got pinned on it.
Right.
But what was happening, and we do know this, was an awful lot of people were imitating the mannerisms and the dress of young Werther.
Which is very like preempting this 20th century,
Yeah,
isn't it?
and of course, it's not the first time there was moral panic, but it's probably the first time there's a kind of one of the first times there's a really modern panic, and by that it coincides with the emergence of mass culture. So people are starting to literacy is starting to spread, and of course it's also more internationalized. So a novel is written in Germany, and it's influencing everywhere.
Right. Even though people aren't all using Latin, but I suppose that's probably
Well, we're well past that. I mean, people are still learning Latin, of course, in schools and universities. But
I'm wondering,
national languages are emerging in a big time.
But are there more translations generally?
Yeah. So most people are reading this in translations or in the original.
Because he's translated in his own lifetime into English. And there's an argument about whether Coleridge does it. I mean, people think probably...
Yeah, he's quite translated, partly because so many of the Romantics are obsessed with Goethe.
Right.
So
the English ones,
so Byron is massively influenced by Goethe, as is Thomas Carlyle. So if you know Carlyle, he's the person who invents the great man theory of history sometimes, as it's sort of sometimes put. And of course, but he's getting a lot of this out of Goethe.
Right. I'm going to open this to the audience now, so if you can go first. Since you've been in the front row, I think you share the privilege of asking the first question.
To what extent, given the sheer volume of work...
Do I want to...
Yeah, so...
Hold it about here,
Yeah.
To what extent, given the volume of work, is he also a sort of a creator or a unifier or codifier of modern German? I mean, you talked about all those many states speaking German, but presumably with lots of different dialects and lots of different usages. Is there a thing that, a canon, which comes out of his writing?
So interestingly, no, it's not like with Dante and Florence. It's he's actually writing in his local dialect. So his poetry, particularly, is in the dialect of the region around Frankfurt. So he's not particularly. So he's not one of these sort of linguistic formalizers.
But does that influence how? Because Dante influences how Tuscan becomes Italian.
Yeah, so there doesn't. So he's very influential on German language and culture, but he's not. German is not quite as disparate as Italian is at the age of Dante.
Right.
By this point.
It's like High German and Low German, but quite similar. Okay.
So how is that spreading across Europe so quickly if you've got those dialects?
Oh well, first of all, the dialects are pretty. I mean, again, they're quite subtle. Like I said, it's not. These are not kind of very necessarily dialects where people are unable to communicate with each other. They just give different significances to the words and the stresses. So for poetic reasons, it matters, but in terms of ordinary communication, it's quite straightforward. And also, people are reading Goethe. A lot of them are reading Goethe in German, which more and more people are reading German. So a number of people are receiving him right away. Also, people are quoting bits of Goethe in letters. So bear in mind, like I talked at the beginning about epistolary culture and novels. Letters are a bit like the internet of their day. So things are moving faster through the kind of network of belles lettres, through this kind of culture of letters, than they are through full text arriving. So people are hearing about this amazing novel in Germany, they're getting fragments of it, and they're demanding the book, and then someone gets the book, and then they tell other people about it, and then someone reprints it, sometimes in a rogue way, sometimes they translate it. So stuff is happening in this very sort of fast, often faster than you would imagine.
I was just wondering, because you've alluded to it throughout your talk, just if you could talk a little bit more about Goethe's religious views, because you mentioned his religion of nature and his sort of proto-Romantic religion, but I'd just love you to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I mean, Goethe is very heterodox. So his mother was something of a kind of Protestant pietist, and I think there's one period of childhood illness where he describes sort of having a conversion experience, but then he gets over that pretty quickly. Goethe's religion is very hard to define, but broadly speaking, you could define it best as a sort of nature religion. And by that, he means several very specific things. So he means that he's a believer in what we would now probably call vitalism. So he thinks that the world is alive, and he thinks that there's a kind of living intelligent spirit. So similar to what Hegel will say about the world soul. So
very German, isn't it?
Very German. He also he's quite positive about Christianity. So you might think from all this that he's some kind of skeptic. He's not particularly. He just doesn't feel especially bound by Christianity. So the Virgin turns up quite a lot. Lots of Catholic imagery turns up in his. So again, he has a certain amount of sympathy towards Catholicism, and he loves the medieval past. So he's someone who sort of thinks positively about religion and tradition. But it's almost, and this is quite shocking to us because we think of, and partly because of course England at this time would have been more religiously conservative in these circles. It would have been, you could never have been Goethe in England at this time. Unthinkable that you could be there were people who were doing this, but they were not respectable. They certainly weren't in the royal circles. So Goethe is in a religious culture in Germany that's changed unbelievably quickly. So people we're seeing the very early beginnings of biblical criticism. So this is the so-called higher criticism, which starts questioning the truth of religious doctrine. I mean, Goethe, in his own descriptions of his education in theology at Leipzig, talks about how people are defending, of course, in sort of plonking Protestant fashion, the truth of the Bible, but they're doing it with a historical critical method. That's already the case in Germany at the time.
Is that partly down to the fact that there's lots of different states, and so, if you're a bit unorthodox, there's bound to be some prince who sympathises a little bit.
That's part of it, but it's also the fact that Germany is weirdly outside of confessionalism. So you've almost certainly heard of the Treaty of Westphalia in relationship to the origin of the modern state. But while that creates certain important legal principles for other states, the irony is, of course, the Treaty of Westphalia precisely prevents German states from becoming modern states. So what it does is, in effect, they fight the 30 Years' War over what denomination all these tiny little states are going to be. So an army comes in, flips it Protestant, flips it Catholic, flips it Protestant. So to stop this happening, the Treaty of Westphalia says you freeze it in place. So it doesn't matter what the demographics are, doesn't matter what the prince believes, the state is going to be Protestant or it's going to be Catholic, depending on where it is at the end of the 30 Years' War. What this creates is a weird situation in which every other state has a different denomination, and also there's no ability to really change it, which creates an odd degree of psychological and intellectual security. Because nothing is changing, you can think anything. It's a very low stakes environment. So this means that you're able to do things in Germany that you couldn't do in France or England, both of which are confessional states. Even after the revolution, France is a kind of confessional state for rationalism.
Alex?
So the two most famous quotations from Goethe, possibly the two most famous quotations in German literature, Überall in Gipfeln ist Ruhe, above every hilltop is peace, and Verweile doch, du bist so schön, tarry a while, stay a while, thou art so fair, both about rest, and the latter are the terms on which Faust sells his soul. If he ever finds something so satisfying that he wants to hold on to it forever, then his bill will come due. But what he actually finds in Faust that is so satisfying is precisely a vision of dynamism, a society that's constantly changing. So first question is, what do you make of the fact that that is heaven in a sense for Goethe, that it's not a place of rest but a place of endless change? Secondly, what do you make of the fact that, in fact, Goethe's Faust, unlike Marlowe's Faust, unlike the medieval Faust, does not have to pay his bill? He doesn't go to hell. He gets redeemed after all.
Well, there's something very interesting and quite clever that Goethe does about what you've just mentioned about rest. So you say it's heaven. Well, is it? Because he says, you get to send me to hell if I ever cease striving. So what this does is so just think about this for a moment. If I ever have a moment of such perfect kind of psychological bliss, what Nietzsche will later describe as the eternal recurrence of the same, a moment where I just will that moment to continue forever, then at that point, if I experience paradise, at that point you can send me to hell. But at that point, you're in this kind of almost Zen-like, Buddhist-like point of like perfect bliss, whereby it doesn't matter if you're in heaven and hell, you're already have attained what you're going for. On the other hand, you could read this so in one way it's a clever double game, but you could also read this as saying that he's saying that the state of hell would actually be equivalent to that. So he's saying, if I ever stop trying yearning some further horizon, at that point I've gone to hell. Heaven is eternal striving. And both readings I think are available, and I think are intended to be available.
Thank you.
We just have to pass it always closer to someone, you know.
How do you think his literary philosophy and political philosophy were changed both by being at the Battle of Valmy and by meeting Napoleon?
Yes, I mean this is interesting. There's so many incredible biographical details one could have put in. Not the least of which is he met Napoleon, and of course Napoleon, when he went to Germany, had a pocket of Young Werther in his copy of Young Werther in his pocket. So not very much, funnily enough. The thing which may sound odd to us, but you have to understand that Goethe spent most of his life meeting people who were the greatest X, Y, or Z. So it's not to say he was a big admirer of Napoleon. I think Napoleon as a figure had a big influence on him because he knew about him as a figure in history. But by the time he actually met him, I don't think it made a big impact on Goethe because he was regularly unfazed by incredibly important and famous people. He probably thought he was more important. In fact, everything we can see about his psychology suggests the man was remarkably arrogant.
I mean, he's famous for the phrase here, the new epoch has begun. That was when he was working for the Prussian army, or.
I mean, he was the military commissioner of Saxe Weimar, so he was working with.
So again, they put a novelist in charge of.
Yeah.
Is anyone close by who can ask the next question?
You mentioned elective affinities briefly. As I understand it, it's an exploration of a modern electrochemical theory.
Yeah.
In a novella form.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
Could you explain why? And was there an audience for this?
Well, whether there's an audience for it is always a good question with Goethe, because I think his plays were always the most loved of the paying public. So, I mean, Goethe's funny because he's someone who is a sort of renowned celebrity. So people, a bit like Kant going through Königsberg, people remarked on him, he was known. But his actual audience was quite cult. So he was someone who was beloved of intellectuals and also of aristocrats who wanted to look good by admiring him. When it comes to elective affinities, I mean, audience aside, what he's trying to do is very interesting because he's basically trying to apply scientific theories to literature. Now, the result is not the most readable book of all time, but it's something that is actually hugely influential for people who come later. So this idea that there might be a science of human behavior, that it might correspond to physical sciences. First of all, Freud is openly indebted to him. In fact, Freud says at one point that everywhere I have been, a poet is already there. And he had in mind almost certainly, in large part, Goethe.
So he wasn't that well read by the public at large?
So probably, stuff like Werther was very widely read.
Right.
So it very much depends on, and his poetry was popular. And of course, a lot of it was quite scatological and erotic, so it probably had quite a big audience. And a lot of it was set to music as well, which is a big popularising thing. So a lot of these composers are talking to are actually setting, it's people like Liszt, for example, are setting his poetry to music. So he is odd because because you have sometimes with Goethe, he's across so many different fields, so many different art forms. And poetry in the 19th century, like pop music, it's really big. Yeah. Like Tennyson or someone, he's a national figure.
But most of his books would have been sort of outsold by whatever, like the equivalent of Len Dayton or something.
Yeah, it depends on the book. They were pretty popular, but then the literary circles were smaller.
Kind of been the big seller.
Yeah, Electric Affinities was read by a lot of people,
right.
But it was partly because it was Goethe. How many people would buy it and leave it on the shelves? I don't know.
It's history of time.
Exactly.
Is anyone around there? Who's got the thing?
Thank you. In terms of where to start, starting my own junior Canon club, I play my grandsons, who are age 2,
the Erlkönig, wer reitet so spät durch Nacht und Wind. So if anyone wants to start their exploration of Goethe, you couldn't do better than with Schubert and the Erlkönig. And I must say they find it very exciting, although their mothers insist it gets turned off before in seinen Armen das Kind war tot.
Yeah, I'd hope so.
We're not allowed to get to the end. But on a completely, but still, it's a good introduction, and they'll be the people coming to the Canon Club hopefully in 20 years' time. In terms of the last question, actually, I wanted to pick up on the science, because there is a view that Goethe kind of could have taken science in a completely different direction. He had a very original view of natural science and the physical universe. Can you tell us something about, because I know that, but I don't know any more than that. So can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, so Goethe is a very significant figure in the emergence of Germany of what's called natural philosophy. And you see this in figures like Schiller and Schelling. And basically, it's partly what I alluded to with the religious question. It's a sort of vitalist conception. And in fact, it's one that's not without influence in Europe. So someone like Bergson, for example, is very influenced by this. How to describe it? It's you see this in his Metamorphosis of Plants, particularly. It's this idea that nature is alive, and that it has a kind of linguistic intellectual quality. So, you see, so in terms of, if you imagine the Darwinian theory of evolution, which is very Newtonian and kinetic, it's about you're trying to describe the processes. It's much more about the idea that nature itself as a whole is alive. And this, of course, you might think is quite fanciful and spiritualist, but actually it's something that later scientists have taken seriously. So I don't know if you know about the so-called Gaia hypothesis, the idea that nature itself is a kind of emergently complex system which is self-regulating. So some quite advanced ideas in philosophy and science are already going back to in the forms of in the philosophical world, panpsychism has become more and more popular, and these are all things that you can find in Goethe.
Sorry, just picking up on that. Were any of the famous 19th century German scientists interacted with Goethe in this?
Yes, someone asked me something earlier about Schopenhauer, and I had to tell them I had no idea, because when it comes to who Goethe knew and who he influenced, the answer is usually everyone. So I can say that in terms of his colour theory, it was taken very seriously. So it was quite a significant. So I know that an awful people did read it and in fact use it practically. I can't say exactly who in the German scientific world read it, because again I'm just not familiar enough.
Oh, yeah, pass up.
Thank you. You mentioned, the important historical changes and the principalities that sort of led to Goethe. You also mentioned the great man of history theory came a little bit later. So, was he a product of it? Well, he obviously was a product of his time, but had he not been born, would there have been another Goethe?
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Depends if you think that the unique genius is produced by the forces of history so that they can happen, or if blind forces direct our lives and we just pin a guy on it. Without speculating about theories of history, I'll just say that I genuinely think history would have been different without Goethe. And the reason I say that is because obviously there's an element to which people needed a kind of German Shakespeare. They wanted someone to pin all this on. But because it was Goethe, certain things, for good and ill, become more pronounced in German thought, I think. So particularly, his vitalism, his organicism, it's not determined, it's not obvious. I mean, Kant isn't thinking in those terms. Like the fact that becomes so dominant, including in German political thought, is I think partly down to Goethe. And obviously Goethe is also someone bear in mind, it's a golden generation. A lot of people of incredible significance in German history are alive and know Goethe. But what makes Goethe quite unique is he partly synthesizes, knows, sort of dramatizes or romanticizes it. So that Goethe sort of is this Well, he's in a sense, even if he's not always the best practical playwright, in terms of like the great theatre of history, he's the paramount dramatist. He's someone who is able to kind of direct this incredible German drama of history.
He played some role in Shakespeare's very big in Germany, but he played a role in popularising.
Well, he's the reason.
Right.
I mean, he himself only encounters.
I listened to a podcast recently, and it was just all about how Shakespeare.
He's obsessed with Shakespeare. If you had known one person that Goethe loved, it was above anyone else. It's Shakespeare.
Right. He was kind of. I mean, he was lucky in the sense, obviously a genius, but to have lived in a kind of among a cluster of geniuses, and I think
that's very true.
Throughout history, that's a kind of running theme. London at the time had the sort of the people gathering at the Turk's Head, and I think without the other members of the group, there wouldn't have been
completely. And you see this absolute step change after he meets Herder. That's the point at which he really starts shifting to a more serious and intentional form of art. Because up to this point, he's sort of been dealing with this much more kind of sleepy, dusty bits of kind of provincial German academia. He hasn't met someone who's got that kind of real philosophical originality. In Herder, he finally meets one of the greats, and it changes everything.
Right. And is he? I mean, in England, he's not. I mean, he's not really well known. I mean, he's
not
heard of, but no one reads him or no one watches his play. I mean, is he taught in Germany still to the same extent?
Well, he's still. The people who want him in a German education system better than me, but as far as I know, he's still very well known and read in Germany. I think I can speak to the English context. He's incredibly well known in the 19th century,
right,
to an unbelievable extent, because he's the driving force of Romanticism. But I think the point at which he really starts to fade of the explosion of Romanticism is when Britain in general falls out of love with German academia and culture,
right,
and that happens sometime in the post-war period. So that sort of the great, so that you see it across a lot of fields.
Post First War?
No, post World War II actually. So people are still, the Germanophile thing continues quite a long time. So you see this in biblical criticism and theology and philosophy. People really start the sort of thing that there's a period where everyone has to learn German, and there's a period where they just stop.
I mean, Germany's cultural influence is just kind of shattered after 1933.
Well, and that's the other thing. There's less worth reading. People are not reading. There's the original work isn't there in the same scale.
And are the translations considered? Do people consider any of them authentic enough to sort of get the truth?
Depends on the translation.
Complexity
obviously,
and deepness of German, which
I will say it's translation of German. Any poetry is not going to be particularly good, but the translations of Goethe are not great when it comes to the poetry. The really famous stuff has some good translations, but it's not. It's quite mixed, partly because people there aren't enough contemporary, really high quality translations.
Right. Any more questions before we let you go to the pub? The gentleman over there, right towards the back. Right. Yeah. Throw it in. See what.
I think you meant.
Quick intermediate question.
Yes.
If he was so popular in early 19th century Britain, why were there no good translations?
Well, there were probably good translations for the standard of the time, but bear in mind there was not.
Translations have to be updated, didn't they?
There's not the same rigor. So you have whoever happens to do it. It's as good as whoever happens. Yeah, in some cases, it's whoever happens to do it at the time. And obviously, more people read German then. Than a lot of people are just reading it in the German. The translation just to popularise it.
Linking back to one of the earlier Canon talks on Wagner and that link between creating a sort of mythology back for Germany, what was Wagner's influence, or Goethe's influence on Wagner, if any?
Well, it's considerable. For one thing, again, if you could name any German figure of the late 19th century, and you would probably say that. But the particular significance in Goethe's case is he's a big, as you may have got some sense from the talk, he's a strong medievalist. He uses a lot of Gothic imagery. He's got a strong sense for this kind of Volkish kind of feeling of kind of ordinary German language and humanity. So obviously Wagner would, like a lot of more nationalistic Germans, didn't approve of Goethe's cosmopolitanism.
What was his role as a minister? Did that reflect his literary interest? Was he a very rationalist person of the early 19th century in his governing style?
Well, both, because one thing that people often find complex or interesting about Goethe is that he's someone who's both deeply associated with Romanticism and with neoclassicism, which is sometimes seen as in contradiction. So Goethe is very much, and if you want to kind of imagine how these kinds of reconcile, it's very much he's an empiricist. He's not a rationalist. He's not exactly an irrationalist. He's an empiricist. So his approach. This is probably what partly makes him a very good administrator, apart from having quite a lot of general capability and a lot of energy. Goethe is very good at trying what works and stopping when it doesn't, and despite being incredibly disagreeable, he's also rather good at taking advice. And he's very good at kind of borrowing from everyone he meets. So as an administrator, first, in some cases, it's also easy mode. Like German states are kind of quite irrational. You can change simply by having a lot of energy and not caring what people think. He got a lot done.
One more question, this gentleman there.
I suppose it follows on quite well from that, and apologies if you've already made this clear and I didn't pick it up, but well, as you just said, he sort of sat in between the sort of rationalist, classical, very Enlightenment attitude towards all intellectual endeavours, literature, and they're purely romantic, emotionally driven. What did he make of the sort of pure romantics, shall I say? And in particular, it just came to mind, like the Brothers Grimm. Maybe they're not archetypal romantics, but I believe they were influenced by Herder, just like Goethe had a very strong influence, close relationship with him, and I think they were even from the same part of Germany. So yeah, what did he make of them? These sort of pure romantics, maybe the English ones as well, but certainly the German ones who sort of discarded, just totally rebelled against rationalism.
We may go too far in drawing in imposing these kind of categories. So, look at a figure like Kant. We think of him as the very definition of the Enlightenment. But what Kant is actually, unlike earlier, more kind of Renaissance influenced figures, he's not saying that there's a kind of beautiful, noble reality that we can know purely through reason. He's actually saying that much of the world is fundamentally unknoble and has to be approached through a glass darkly, through this kind of like process of empiricism, which actually puts an awful lot of significance back on subjectivity and the individual and sensation, which is quite suitable for romantic view. So you can see that kind of what we're calling Romanticism, what we're calling Enlightenment, there's an element of truth to them, but the people at the time may not see it in those terms.
Right. I think we better let everyone go and go to the pub or go for a meal or do whatever. But once again, thanks so much for fascinating talks.